Good morning, students. In this lecture, this is the lecture 3 for Consumer Protection Act. And in this lecture, we are going to discuss few concepts which are important to understand the rights and duties of consumer under Consumer Protection Act, and in what cases the rights will be available. In order to understand these things, we need to understand as to who is a consumer, what are goods, and what are services. So first we'll take up as the concept relating to consumer. When we talk about a consumer, it is a term which is defined as someone who acquires goods or services for direct use or ownership rather than for resale or use in production and manufacturing. To say consumer is one who decides whether or not to buy an item at the store, or someone who is influenced by advertisement and marketing. Every time someone goes to a shop and buys a thing, they make a decision as a consumer. So such person who are purchasing goods from the shop at the shop, they are considered to be consumers. When we talk about consumer in the field of economics, marketing and advertisement, a consumer is generally defined as one who pays to consume the goods and services produced by a seller. That can be a company, organization. A consumer can also be a person or group of people, generally categorized as an end user or target demographic for product, goods, or services. In words of Mahatma Gandhi ji, who was the father of nation, who attached great importance to what he has to be described as consumer. In his terms, he described consumer as the poor consumer who, according to him, should be principal beneficiary of the consumer movement. He said, "A consumer is the most important visitor on our premises. He is not dependent on us, we are on him. He is not an interruption to our work, he is the purpose of it. We are not doing a favor to a consumer by giving him an opportunity. He is doing us a favor by giving an opportunity to serve him." When we talk about consumer under law, we say that it is a term which has been defined under Section 2, Subclause 7 of New Act, that is Act of 2019, and Section 2(1)(d) of the old Act, that is Act of 1986. When we talk about a consumer means any person who buys any good for a consideration which has been paid or promised or partly paid and partly promised or under any system of deferred payment, and includes any user of such goods other than the other person who buys such good for consideration paid or promised or partly promised or under any system of deferred payment, when such use is made with the approval of such person, but does not include a person who obtains such goods for resale or for any commercial purpose. So the first clause of section 2(7) clearly states, or say 2(1)(d) clearly states, that it's a person, it's a consumer, it's a person who is purchasing goods and they are paying consideration for these goods. It also includes and within it the services that are hired, not only the goods but also the services which is given under clause 2 of the act, of the section as mentioned under the act. Clause 2 says hires or avails of any service for consideration which has been paid or promised. So clause 2 is talking about the services, and these services can we will take up as to what do we understand by services at a later part of the lecture. But when we talk about consumer, we are saying that the consumer is a person who is availing goods and services for the consideration. They are paying for these goods and services, and thus they are said to be consumers, and the consumption is for their own personal use. After the amendment that has been introduced, the second explanation was added to the act that provided for the expression buys any good or hires or avails any services, that also includes offline or online transactions. So this part was not something that was included in the Act of 1986, but after the amendment, it also includes any goods or services that you're hiring online or offline transaction. Even the online services, if you're purchasing online goods, that will also be included within the ambit of the Consumer Protection Act, that clearly says includes offline or online transactions through electronic means or by teleshopping or direct selling or multi-level marketing. That has widened the scope of consumer, the definition of consumer. So even a consumer on availing services on internet, a person availing internet services or purchasing goods on internet will also be covered within the definition of consumer after the amendment of 2019. Thus, according to this definition, a person to be a consumer should satisfy that the goods are bought for consideration, and person buying goods for self-employment is who is considered to be a consumer. Any person who uses the goods with the approval of the buyer is also covered within the concept of consumer. A consumer is a person who purchases a product or avails a services for consideration. The consideration may be paid, promised, partly paid, and partly promised. So, to say there should be a sale transaction between the seller and buyer, the sale should be of goods, and the buying of goods should be for consideration. It also includes a beneficiary of such goods or services when such use is made with the approval of such person. That is, person who uses the goods with the approval of the buyer. When a person buys goods, it may be used by his family members, relatives, and friends. Any person who actually uses the goods may come under the defects in goods. Thus, the law ensures the users of the goods as consumer, although they may not be buyers at the same time. Like, for example, if a person X purchases a car which was used by his brother Y, the brother Y was using it and taking it to the seller for repair and service, etc. Later on, the brother Y had a complaint with the car and sued the seller. The seller pleaded that since Y he is not a buyer, he was not a consumer under the Consumer Protection Act. The Delhi State Commission held that Y, the complainant, was using it with the approval of X, who is the actual buyer, and therefore he was a consumer within the Act. It is a case that the decision that was taken up in Dinesh Bhagat versus Bajaj Auto Limited. Another aspect, another essential is that either a person does not use the goods for resale or commercial purposes, which says that the goods have to be used either for the personal use or to earn his livelihood by means of self-employment and not using it for resale purpose. When the goods are bought to resell or commercially exploit, then such buyers or users will not be considered as consumer within the Act. Like, for example, a car was purchased to run, it acts as a taxi. The question was whether the buyer of the car was a consumer under the Act or not. The Rajasthan State Commission held that the use of the car as a taxi with the object to earn profit was a commercial purpose, and therefore the buyer user was not a consumer within the meaning of the Act. This is the case which was taken up by the court, and the case is Pushpa Meena versus Saha Enterprises. Hence, if a particular good is used for commercial purpose, then the buyer user will not be consumer under the Consumer Protection Act of 1986, or what we call it as 2019. The fourth aspect is person buying goods for self-employment. When goods are bought for commercial purpose and such purchase satisfies the following criteria, that is, the goods are used by the buyer himself exclusively for the purpose of earning his livelihood by means of self-employment, then such use would not be termed for commercial purpose under the Act, and the user would be recognized as consumer. For example, X buys a car for using it as a taxi by driving it by himself. X will be considered as consumer if he hires a driver to drive the taxi, then he will not be considered as a consumer. The intention of the legislatures is to exclude big business houses carrying on business with profit motive from the purview of the Act. At the same time, it is pertinent to save the interests of small consumers who buy goods for self-employment to earn livelihood, like a rickshaw puller buying rickshaw for self-employment, or a farmer purchasing fertilizers for his crop, or taxi driver buying a car to run its own taxi. Now the next question comes, that who is not a consumer? Now when we talk about this question, we say that a person is not a consumer if he or she purchases any goods or avail any services free of charge, purchases a good or hire a services for resale or commercial purposes, avails any services under the contract of service. Now there are few cases under this. First is UT Chandigarh Administration versus Amarjeet Singh, wherein the court held that with reference to a public auction of existing sites, the purchaser is not a consumer, the owner is not a trader or service provider, and the grievance does not relate to any matter with respect to complaint, and therefore complaint cannot be filed. Therefore, any grievance by the purchaser will not give rise to complaint or consumer dispute under the Act. There will be no jurisdiction of the consumer court in order to entertain or decide any complaint by auction purchasers against the owner holding the auction of site. So this is a case wherein court has held that because it was not for self-consumption or for self-employment, it will not be considered a case for that will fall within the purview of Consumer Protection Act. Next question comes, who is a consumer? A person is a consumer of services in with respect to what, who will be with respect to the services. The services are hired or availed of for the consideration, and there should be some consideration that should be paid. Beneficiary of services will also be considered as a consumer, like in the case of goods, similarly applicable with respect to services. Now, when we talk about who will be a person who is availing the services, there are few conditions. First, a person to be consumer, he should satisfy that for the hiring or availing the services. The term hire has not been defined under the Act, but ultimately consumer of services may be a person who avails or uses the services. What constitute hiring has been dealt with in many consumer disputes cases. Like for example, A goes to a doctor to get himself treated for an illness. Here A is hiring the services of doctor. Thus, he is a consumer. A passenger getting railway reservation after payment is hiring services for consideration. Similarly, a third is the example where a landlord neglects and refuses to provide the agreed amenities, then it is also a consumer. Second is consideration should have been paid or is payable. When we say consideration, it is an important and essential part for hiring or availing of any services. However, its payment need not necessarily be immediate and could be in installments. A person will not be consumer for services provided without charging anything in return. For example, A hires an advocate to file a suit for recovery of money from his employer. He promises to pay fees to advocate after settlement of the dispute. A is a consumer under the Act. Similarly, is the example which is given where the X was paying a property tax. Which kindly go through the example. Next is third essential is that the person is beneficiary of such services. For example, when a person hires services, he may hire it for himself or for any other person. In such cases, the beneficiary of these services is also a consumer. For example, A takes his son B to doctor for his treatment. Here A is hiring services of the doctor and B is the beneficiary of the services. For the purpose of the Act, both A and B will be consumers. Next concept that we need to understand is that of goods and services that have been defined as shown in the slide with respect to old and new Act. Now, when we talk about goods, we means every kind of movable property other than actionable claims and money, and includes stocks and shares, growing crops, grass, things attached to forming part of the land, which are agreed to be severed before the sale or under the contract of sale. Goods are those products which are manufactured or produced and sold to consumers through wholesalers and retailers. When we talk about services, we say that it means any description which is made available to potential users and include but is not limited to the provisions of facilities in connection with banking, finance, insurance, transport, processing, supply of electrical, boarding, lodging, housing, entertainment, amusement, purveying of news or other information, but does not include the rendering of any services free of charge or under a contract of personal service. Here we need to understand the difference between contract or service that implies a relationship of master and servant and involves to obey the order in work to be performed and is a part that does not form the part of Consumer Protection Act. Contract for service implies a contract where one party undertakes to render services, example professional or technical services, and this is what forms part of and is covered under Consumer Protection Act. Thus, where there is a contract of service, it will not form the part of the Act, but wherever the contract for service exists, it will form the part of Consumer Protection Act. And one can claim compensation for the deficiency in services in case there is infringement of contract for service. Here we are done with the concepts. Next class we'll continue with the act. Thank you.